The most dangerous sentence I hear from retirees is not about inflation. It is not about taxes. It is not even about market crashes. It is this: I never want to sell my shares. When I hear that, I understand the feeling immediately. And I also hear the danger inside it, because most people who say that are not really talking about arithmetic. They are talking about fear. They are saying they do not want to watch their share count go down. They do not want to feel as if they are eating their own future. They do not want to press a sell button and wonder whether they just harmed the machine that was supposed to protect them for the rest of their lives. That fear is real, but fear, when dressed up as a rule, can become expensive. I've spent a long time watching investors confuse what feels safe with what actually works. And if you want to understand the dividend debate honestly, that is where you have to begin. Not with theory, not with slogans, not with charts pulled out of context. You begin with the emotional truth. Selling shares feels dangerous. Dividends feel natural. That is why the argument never dies. The reference document you gave me starts in exactly the right place. It shows the two extreme camps. One arguing they would never sell shares in retirement and would rather live off dividends forever. The other insisting dividends do not matter, and only total return counts. Then it makes the crucial move that most amateur debates skip. It explains that dividends are not free money because the stock price adjusts down by roughly the dividend amount on the ex-dividend date, while also acknowledging that for many retirees, dividends still feel behaviorally easier than selling shares. That tension is the real heart of the issue. Fate fellow site Fay turn 26 file 0 Fay. If I were explaining this in plain language, I would say it like this. A dividend is not a gift. It is not extra wealth arriving from nowhere. It is a transfer. Cash leaves the company and comes to you at the same time. The company now has less cash than it had before, which is why the share price adjusts. So if a stock is worth $100 and pays you $2, you are not suddenly richer in any magical sense. You may now have $98 in stock and $2 in cash. That may feel safer than selling $2 of stock, but mechanically, money still left the portfolio. That is the first reality, and I do not think investors should be protected from that reality, because once you hide the mechanics from yourself, you start building a retirement plan on top of emotion alone. That is not wise. The source text is very clear about this point and even says that from a math standpoint, dividends and withdrawals are twins, because either way, cash comes out and portfolio value declines by a corresponding amount. That is a strong and useful correction to the fairy tale version of dividend investing. Faithful site Fay turn 26 file 0 Fay, but there is a second reality sitting beside the first one. People are not built like calculators. A strategy can be mathematically elegant and still be emotionally unlivable. I have seen people abandon good plans because the plan demanded a behavior they hated. And I have seen people stay disciplined with slightly less elegant plans because the plan fit their nerves. The reference document says this well too. It points out that behavior often beats optimization for most retirees, and that if dividend income helps a person stay invested, sleep better, and avoid panic, that behavioral value is real. The mistake is not in valuing that comfort. The mistake is in assuming that comfort somehow repeals arithmetic. Fay file site Fay turn 26 file 1 Fay turn 26 file 4 Fay. That distinction matters enormously, because once you understand it, the dividend debate becomes less childish. It stops being dividends are everything or dividends are nothing. It becomes a more mature question. What role should dividends play inside a retirement plan that must satisfy both arithmetic and human behavior? That is the right question now. Let us go deeper, because one of the most abused facts in this entire conversation is historical dividend data. People love to say that dividends contributed a huge part of stock market returns. That statement is true. It is also often badly misunderstood. The source file notes that from around 1940 through 2024, dividends contributed roughly 1/3 of the S&P 500's total return on average. But then it adds the crucial clarification. Those historical figures assume dividends were reinvested. They were not being withdrawn and spent. They were being used to buy more shares, which then produced more dividends, which bought more shares again. That recursive loop is where the power came from. Fay file cite Fay turn 26 file 0 Fay, that is one of the most important lessons in the whole discussion. Reinvested dividends are a compounding engine. Spent dividends are a distribution decision. Those are not the same thing. A young investor pointing to the historical contribution of dividends is often really pointing to the power of reinvestment. A retiree trying to fund living expenses from dividends is doing something else entirely. He is interrupting the loop. He is using the fruit instead of planting the seeds back into the orchard. There is nothing wrong with that if the orchard is already large enough, but the investor must be honest about what changed. The reference text illustrates this with a long-run example showing that $100 invested in the S&P in 1926 grows to a staggering amount by the end of 2025 when dividends are reinvested, while the ending wealth without reinvestment is dramatically smaller. That comparison matters because it teaches the correct lesson. The historical miracle was not the dividend check by itself. The miracle was the reinvestment of that check over and over again for decades. Fay file cite Fay turn 26 file 0 Fay turn 26 file 3 Fay. So when people build modern retirement fantasies around those historical charts, they often commit a quiet error. They keep the emotional appeal of dividends, but switch the math underneath the story. They talk as if a dividend-only retirement plan today will inherit all the power of long-run dividend history. But long-run dividend history was mostly about compounding through reinvestment, not about spending the payouts while preserving the same growth path. That is a very important difference, and it becomes even more important once we talk about the world we actually live in now, not the one our grandparents invested through. The source text is very useful here as well. It says broad U.S. equity yields historically sat closer to 3 to 5%. But in recent decades, especially since the early 1990s, yields have been much lower, often closer to 1 to 2%. It also explains why the rise of growth in technology companies, the increasing use of buybacks instead of cash dividends, and the fact that share prices have grown faster than payouts all reduce broad market yields. Fay file cite Fay turn 26 file 2 Fay turn 26 file 3 Fay. That changes everything for the retiree who says, I just want to live off the dividends. In a higher yield world, that statement might have been much easier to make true with a broad portfolio. In a lower yield world, that same statement forces a trade. Either you need a much larger portfolio, or you need much lower spending, or you need to reach for higher yield assets, specialized funds, REITs, utilities, energy, telecom, business development companies, covered call funds, or other income-heavy vehicles that come with their own costs and risks. That is the part people often skip. They say dividends feel safer. Perhaps they do. But once the yield on a broad market portfolio is only around 1 to 2%, dividends-only retirement becomes a very expensive emotional preference. Not emotionally expensive, capital expensive. That is a different thing. And adults should name their trades. That is a phrase I return to again and again in investing. Name the trade. If you want the psychological comfort of living mostly from dividends, excellent. But then admit what that comfort asks from you. It may ask for more capital. It may ask for lower spending. It may ask for more concentration. It may ask for slower long-term growth. It may ask for tax complications. It may ask for dividend. Cut risk right at the moment you were counting on stability. There is nothing wrong with making that trade consciously. The danger comes when people pretend there is no trade. Now let us speak about taxes, because this is where many people become overconfident with partial knowledge. The source text handles this very well. It explains that qualified dividends and long-term capital gains are often taxed at the same favorable rates, typically 0%, 15%, or 20%, depending on the household situation, on the surface. That makes dividends and capital gains sound equally attractive. But then it introduces the more important distinction. Dividends are forced realizations, while capital gains are elective realizations. Dividends arrive when the company chooses. Capital gains arrive when you choose to sell. That difference in timing control can matter enormously in retirement, where taxes, Social Security interactions, and Medicare surcharges can all be sensitive to how much income appears in a particular year. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26 file, 2 Fay-Turn 26 file, 3 Fay. This is exactly the kind of nuanced mature investors should care about. Optionality matters, control matters. The person who can choose when to realize gains can often plan taxes more intelligently than the person whose portfolio keeps throwing off income on its own schedule. And then there is another twist. The source text mentions that many people ignore. Not all dividends are qualified. REITs, bond funds, many international funds, and a number of high-yield strategies can generate payouts taxed as ordinary income rather than at favorable qualified rates. So the simple phrase dividends are tax efficient is not always true. Sometimes, yes, sometimes no context decides Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26 file, 2 Fay-Turn 26 file, 3 Fay. That is why I say dividends are a tool, not a religion. A tool, and tools have jobs. A hammer is wonderful when the job is a nail. A hammer is foolish when the job requires a wrench. The same is true in portfolios. Dividends are wonderful for some jobs. They are less useful for others. And this becomes especially obvious once age enters the conversation. One of the best parts of your source document is that it stops pretending a 25-year, old and a 70-year. Old should think about dividends the same way. That is one of the great weaknesses in mass market financial advice. One idea gets preached to every age, every income level, every emotional temperament, and every stage of life, as if human beings were interchangeable. They are not Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26 file, 2 Fay-Turn 26 file, 4 Fay in your 20s. Dividends should usually be background music, not the lead singer. Time is long, human capital is high, career income is still rising at that stage. Your portfolio does not need to act like a paycheck. It needs to act like an engine. The source text says this clearly. High-yield strategies in your 20s often mean sacrificing long-term growth in exchange for income you do not even need to spend. In most cases, the smarter use of dividends at that stage is simply to reinvest them automatically and let them quietly add fuel to compounding. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26 file, 2 Fay in your 30s. That logic mostly holds. Life may get more expensive, responsibility increases, but the horizon is still long enough that growth remains the dominant ally. Some investors may start appreciating dividend, growth exposure, or quality companies that happen to pay dividends, and that can be perfectly reasonable. But the central mistake would still be the same, treating current income as the goal decades before current income is actually needed. Then your 40s arrive. Now the conversation changes a little, not because dividends have suddenly become superior, because volatility starts feeling more personal. The portfolio is larger, the timeline is shorter than it was, a little more ballast can feel meaningful. The source text handles this stage maturely too. It suggests a blend can work well with a broad market core and perhaps some quality or dividend growth exposure for smoother behavior, but still reinvesting the payouts because retirement income is not the main job yet. That is wise. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26, file 4 Fay by your 50s and 60s. The question changes more dramatically. Now retirement is not theoretical anymore. You start asking a very practical question. How will this thing pay me? That is where dividends can become genuinely useful, not magical, useful. The source text says this. Well, dividends can provide natural cash flow, reduce the psychological hurdle of selling shares, and complement a broader withdrawal plan. But then it immediately adds a limitation. Broad index yields are still often around 1 to 2%. Not enough by themselves for most retirees, seeking something like a 3.5 to 4% or higher withdrawal level. Reaching for more yield can mean accepting slower growth, sector concentration, or the possibility of dividend cuts. That is the real trade, Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26 file, 4-Fay. And then, finally, retirement itself. This is where that most dangerous sentence comes back. I never want to sell my shares. I understand why it feels wise. Selling feels irreversible. Selling feels like erosion. Selling feels like drawing down the machine. And dividends feel like the machine simply paying rent on itself. But the source text does the right thing by challenging that feeling with numbers. It says that dividends alone usually do not reach a withdrawal rate that most retirees could rely on, that yields have declined, and that dividends by themselves do not protect you from sequence of returns, risk, inflation, or large irregular spending needs. That is exactly right. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26 file 1, Fay-Turn 26 file 4, Fay. The real objective in retirement is not to avoid selling at all costs. The objective is to create reliable cash flow that lasts as long as you do. That is a very different objective, and once you frame the problem correctly, the solution usually becomes more flexible. The source text says the most successful retirees often use multiple income sources together: dividends, bond interest, realized capital gains, planned tax-efficient share sales, and rebalancing between asset classes. That is what a mature system looks like. It is not emotional loyalty to one mechanism. It is a practical structure built around sustainable cash flow. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26 file 1, Fay-Turn 26 file 4, Fay. I am especially pleased the source text brings up required minimum distributions, because that is another area full of confusion. Many retirees think that if their IRA or 401k throws off dividends, those dividends automatically solve the RMD problem. But that is not how the rules work. The document explains this correctly. Money generated inside an IRA or 401k, whether from dividends, interest, or existing cash, counts toward the RMD only when it actually leaves the account. If the dividend stays inside the account, even if it sits in cash and is not reinvested, it does not count, only distribution counts. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26, File 1, Fay. That distinction matters because it reveals something larger. Mechanics matter. A lot of investor confusion comes from vague language sitting on top of precise rules. The portfolio generated cash fine, but did the cash leave the account? That is the real question. And the source text points out another useful tool here as well. An RMD does not always require selling to cash. In-kind transfers can satisfy the distribution by moving shares themselves out of the tax-deferred account into a taxable account, with the fair market value counting toward the RMD. That matters because it reminds the retiree that flexibility exists if he understands the rules. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26 File 1, Fay. This is why I distrust slogans and admire mechanics. Slogans calm the emotions. Mechanics solve the problem. Now, let me say something about behavior that I think deserves much more respect than it usually gets. A mathematically superior plan that makes you panic is not superior for you. If dividends help you remain invested in ugly markets, that has value. If a small allocation to dividend-oriented strategies makes it easier for you to tolerate volatility, that has value. If natural cash flow reduces the emotional pain of distribution in retirement, that has value. The source text says exactly this. Behavior often beats optimization for most retirees. I think that is one of the most important sentences in the entire file, because retirees do not fail only through bad spreadsheets. They also fail through bad behavior under stress. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 26 File 1, Fay-Turn 26 File 4, Fay. But behavior is not an excuse to ignore math, and math is not an excuse to ignore behavior. The grown-up answer must keep both. That is why I do not laugh at dividend preferences. I laugh only at certainty. I laugh only when someone says dividends are always superior, or always irrelevant, or selling shares is always dangerous, or living off dividends is always the best retirement plan, or total return makes dividends meaningless. Those are slogans for people who want simplicity more than truth. Truth is more nuanced. Truth sounds more like this. Dividends are one source of portfolio cash flow. They are not free money. They are not a substitute for understanding total return. They may help behaviorally. They may create tax constraints. They may require more capital if you rely on them heavily. They may play a major role in a retirement plan. They are rarely the entire plan. That is a more mature sentence. And maturity is what retirement investing needs. Now, if I were reducing the whole question to a single framework, I would say it this way: when you are young, let dividends compound quietly inside a growth-oriented engine. When you are in your middle years, use dividend exposure as a stabilizer only if it genuinely helps you stay the course. But do not confuse present income with the main mission too early. When retirement is approaching, treat dividends as a useful source of natural cash flow inside a broader system. And when you are retired, do not ask how to avoid selling forever. Ask how to build a reliable, tax-aware, behaviorally sustainable cash flow machine that can survive your whole life. That is the real question. And once you ask that question instead, the dividend debate becomes less emotional and much more useful. Because the real goal was never to preserve a share count as though the number itself were sacred. The real goal was always this: income that lasts, peace that lasts. A system you can live with. That is the standard. Everything else is just a preference about which tools you use to get there.